How did the presidential election of 1800 affect Jefferson, and what did he learn from that process?
You know, we're all familiar with the election of 1800 as being a critical election in American history. It's arguably the first election in history, certainly in the U.S. history, where we have a peaceful change of power from one party to another. George Washington had been president. He was a Federalist. John Adams had been president as a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson becomes president. He's a Democratic-Republican. He refers to this as the Revolution of 1800. And he says that it's as important as the Revolution of 1776. But, you know, to understand that, you have to take a half step back and realize what a crisis the country was in the 1790s. In the 1790s, after the French Revolution, both England and France were trying to pull us into the European wars. We end up with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which today we think of as being unconstitutional. But again, this idea that it was criminal to criticize the Congress or the president. And dozens, scores of newspaper editors were being indicted and thrown in jail for criticizing the government. So both the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans, the Adams people and Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, they were really concerned that we might have a civil war in 1800 over this, you know, who's going to run the country. I believe that Jefferson really, once he's elected president, and then of course after the election, the Electoral College is tied. They're having problems with the Electoral College even then. And he is tied with Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be his vice president. And even Alexander Hamilton comes out and says, Jefferson would be better than Burr. Even Jefferson is better than Burr. Burr is a demagogue. He's a megalomaniac. He's a narcissist. You know, he just wants to be president for his own benefit. So once Jefferson becomes president, I believe, and I don't think historians have fully appreciated this, that Jefferson really realizes and takes to heart how dangerous things had been, how close we had come to really destroying the nation and running out the constitutional clock. Later he makes light of that, but at the time I think he's really chastened. And so one of the things that he does, which I think is essential and really is central to our understanding of the presidency today, is he takes on this idea that the president is the one official in the country who speaks for the entire nation and has to talk for all of the American people, has to speak and represent all of the people. So in his inauguration, he makes this famous quote, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Well, I think political scientists look at that and say, well, this is a political speech. He was just making, you know, a political comment. There really wasn't substance to it. But I think this was really very important for Jefferson. He was recognizing that this was going to be central for the presidency to reach out to the entire nation. And then he follows through on this in his government. Very early on, Albert Gallatin, who's his Secretary of Treasury, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do after Hamilton's had been Secretary of Treasury. And Gallatin writes to Jefferson and points out that the Treasury Department is the largest department of the government because you have these customs officers at all the different ports. And they were very concerned about people using their government position for political purposes. And so Gallatin writes a letter to these customs commissioners saying, look, you're still citizens. You have a right to vote. You have a right to have your political opinion, but not on government time. You can't use your government position to promote a political position. And Jefferson writes back, I approve entirely of this letter. So this is almost an early version of the Hatch Act, which is still relevant today. Unfortunately, the Hatch Act is ignored far too often. But here's Jefferson and Gallatin saying, yes, if the country's going to work, we have to, you know, recognize that government officials are still people, but they can't use their government position for political gain. And then he does this over and over again. He does this with the military. He was very concerned that the military was controlled by the Federalists and that it was improper to have military officers basically taking political positions. And so he creates West Point partially because he wants to change that situation, and West Point gets going. And we have this today. Military officials, it's part of the Department of Defense regulations. We recognize they can be political, we recognize they can vote, we recognize they can go to political rallies. They can't wear their uniform at a political rally, because then that looks like they're using their position as a military officer for political purposes. And he does the same thing on religion. He and Madison go back and forth. Madison talks about this and says that, look, that people obviously are religious in their individual capacities as distinct from their official stations. And so he says that officials will be religious, and we can't stop that. We don't want to stop that, but they cannot imply that their religiosity is related to their official position. Their recommendations in that regard should express the true character from which they emanate, their private views, not their government position. So, this election, which, we're all familiar with the election. We know that it was a very nasty election. There was a lot of nasty rhetoric, although critically not from Adams and Jefferson. It was never the president or the potential president using that kind of nasty rhetoric. But it becomes the Revolution of 1800, this change of power from the Federalists to the Republicans. But we need to remember, they really almost destroyed the country in that political battle. And then Jefferson, to remedy that, to address that, really says, look, the president needs to bring everybody in, and we need to stop using our official positions, our government positions, for political gain. That was an anathema for Jefferson. So this is, it was a critical election in 1800.